I had finished this book and I got on the internet and I said, I wonder if there's any incidents of true crime have happened, say, within 20 miles of my home. What I found was this particular incident, Burlingham, New York, which is right outside of Pine Bush, if everyone knows it. And I found not only a series of horrific murders within my local vicinity, but a character whose crimes caught international attention and a woman who was eventually labeled as the worst woman on earth by the New York Times. If you've looked her up on Wikipedia, there's probably about 7 paragraphs, and you can see from the size of my book I found substantially more information. It turned out that this small, frail-looking woman had somehow lured 2 women to her home and murdered them in a seemingly motiveless crime. So, in addition to these 2 women who were lured to her home and somehow murdered, her husband, thought to be missing, was found later buried under the kitchen floorboards.
Oh.
Don't get any ideas, ladies. This didn't work out in the end for her. What I found was a startling lifestyle of indefensible crimes perpetrated by the same woman who stood trial in Sullivan County, New York in the late 1800s for 3 brutal homicides and was suspected of many, many more. But that summer of 1893 was to quickly become very different for those visiting as well as those living in Burlingham. The last week of August, the first week of September in 1893 was to become known as the Week of Accumulated Horrors, as dubbed by the Republican Watchman newspaper out of Monticello in September of 1893. Had reported to Paul Halliday's son, Paul Jr., that his father had not been seen around. He hadn't been working his property as he usually did, and he was very visible because he primarily made his living from processing charcoal and delivering it to a lot of businesses in the area. Paul Jr. went to the property. He was greeted by his stepmother. She explained that his father was not home, and he went to look at some property that he bought in Bloomingburg. While leaving the property, Paul Jr. found that law enforcement was actually watching the home. Based on some of the neighbors' concerns, they were looking for any signs of Paul and just kind of spying on the home. Paul Jr. convinced them they needed to get a search warrant and look in the home. So they did. The local judge, Justice Thayer, provided them with a search warrant, but Lizzie wouldn't let them in the house. They devised a plan where one of the constables was going to take her to Bloomingburg, to the property where Paul Sr. had purchased. So show us where he is. She says okay, she gets in the wagon, they head on over, the other guys head in the house. What they found was very distressing. Again, I'm going to paraphrase so we move along, but they found what looked like a blood-stained rug, a blood-stained rope, evidence, a crowbar was in the house, a board and an axe handle, which both seemed bloodied on the end, and 2 shovels were in the house. There was an extremely large amount of dirt and hay all over the indoor floorboards. They began looking frantically for Paul Sr., as they were certain he had met with foul play, but he was not found. The search eventually led to the property. Seeing the shovels, they were concerned that Paul Sr. was buried somewhere on the grounds. They entered into a small crawl space under the barn. This is a picture of their home. It was called a shanty, and again, this is 1893. Prior to this home, they actually had a full home, but Lizzie burnt it down. Yeah, it's all in the book. I'm sorry to skip right over that, but it is a long and interesting story. The barn had a entrance to a crawl space, which you can see the doorway, and then on what is our right side, there was an area where they could dump compost, manure, and hay, and it would fall into that crawl space. One of the men searching in that area saw something odd buried under the hay and manure. Under closer examination, he saw that it was indeed a human arm protruding from the waste pile. He called out to the others searching, and soon the area under the barn was full of the crew searching for Paul Halliday. To their surprise, they did not find Paul Sr. What they found was not one, but two bodies of women who were completely unknown to any of the men who lived and resided in Burlingame. Immediately, they wire a telegram to Bloomingburg. Bring Lizzie back. We have an issue here. So she comes back, and her demeanor immediately changes. She starts acting insane. She complains that the potato bugs are upon her and starts picking and flecking at her clothes. Constable Scott, who drove her to Bloomingburg, confirms she acted completely sane on the way there and on the way home. While Lizzie's in there, Paul is found. He has been buried underneath the kitchen floorboards, as I said, and I'm going to read just a section from the book regarding that. On the afternoon of September 7th, Lizzie was in Justice Thayer's court, being prepared to be handed over to the authorities in Monticello, when Cornelius Canfield burst in and interrupted the courtroom. The news Canfield brought to the court brought the proceedings to a screeching halt. Paul Halliday's body had been found. It was hidden under the floorboards of the kitchen, and this is an actual crime scene photo of the kitchen showing the disturbed floorboards after he's been disinterred, I guess. He was hidden under the floorboards of the kitchen. Thayer ordered Lizzie into the custody of armed guards again. The coroner, Coroner Roche, was summoned, and the group headed to the Halliday farm. Eventually, hands were visible, tied at the wrists and crossed over at the chest. Then a burlap cloth was noticed, which seemed to be covering the head and face. The men looked at each other gravely before proceeding. Slowly, enough dirt was removed to peel back the cloth, and a collective gasp was emitted by the group. "It's him," one of the men said hoarsely. "It's Halliday." Paul Jr. had stopped looking down the dark hole once the hands had been uncovered. Paul Jr. stood and was slowly backing away from the hole. His worst fears were coming true on this horrible morning. One of the men stood and took Paul Jr. by the arm, offering him comfort and stability if he needed it. He was gently guided to the edge of the hole to identify the body. Paul Jr. looked into the dark pit in the floor and quickly covered his eyes with his hands. "Well?" asked the neighbor, James Henry. Paul Jr. choked out a reply with great difficulty. "It's him." It was decided the men needed to get the authorities to the Halliday farm as soon as possible, and nothing else should be touched. The overwhelming smell of death and decay had begun to fill the small shanty, and doors and windows were thrown wide open. Quickly helped refresh the indoor air, but it was clear that Paul Halliday Sr. had been deceased for some time. Cornelius Canfield was sent to Justice Thayer's to alert the authorities to their finding, while the remaining men stood around the open spot in the floorboards, solemnly bowed their heads, and said a quiet prayer. I'll briefly go through the slides.
You don't want to know the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Stay away from the internet then. Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation about Lizzie, and there's also a lot that's omitted that kind of builds to the ending that you don't want to hear. But so she travels to Monticello and has to wait in Monticello for 9 months for a special session of the Supreme Court to be organized. Yeah. Fair and speedy trial, not really in this case, but there was a lot of work to be done. The district attorney for Sullivan County, David S. Hill, sincerely felt that this woman had help in committing these crimes. The distance between the home and the barn was significant enough that he felt she wasn't strong enough. She was about 5'2" and 105 pounds. So he was trying to find out if she had any help. In that time that she's in Monticello, Nellie Bly visits her. There, we have someone who knows Nellie Bly. Anybody else?
Mhm.
Yeah, Nellie Bly was
Famous journalist. Yeah.
famous female journalist at the same time frame as the murders, and she was a lot like Geraldo Rivera was for her time. She was the person who was willing to try and create those exposés. She even went undercover and went into a female mental asylum to try and expose the horrible conditions there, which she did. By Nellie Bly visiting and interviewing her, we have the bulk of details because not only did Nellie Bly say, I'm going to take this woman's word for whatever she says, but Nellie Bly sent reporters far and wide searching for Lizzie's past. So in that, a lot of the information from the book comes from Nellie Bly's research, and then it's placed in the book chronologically. So there'll be a lot of quotes. You'll say they're coming straight out of Nellie Bly's research. So what we find about Lizzie from all this is she had told her husband that she was a recent immigrant from Ireland. Well, really, she was here ever since childhood. Paul didn't know it, but he was her sixth husband. She was in her 20s. Yeah, six marriages. There's no record of divorces, unfortunately. Yeah. And she was linked to a lot of previous crimes. There's unsolved murder in Wurtsboro in 1890. The burning of Paul's property, his home burnt, his barn burnt. His son, who was developmentally disabled, died in that fire. The jury is selected, and they see, and really rather quickly, this is not a bifurcated trial where they're now deeming insanity on one, are we deciding insanity on one and guilt or innocence on the other? So basically, if they decided she was insane, she would be not guilty via insanity. She's quickly found guilty. She's the first woman in the world sentenced to die in the electric chair. But there's a flower for Lizzie. It's Governor Flower of New York, who quickly, so quickly in fact, that this commission was already ready to roll, he appoints a commission to study whether or not she's insane. And she's transported to Danmora, which is Clinton Correctional Facility, where she's evaluated and deemed to be insane. The alternative is life in a mental institution, and that's what she's given. She's sentenced to Mattawan in Fishkill for the rest of her life, which is now closed. So I'll just get to this. In 1901, Lizzie petitioned for her husband's military pension benefits and receives them.
Really?
The husband kills himself. The wife can't benefit from his military pension.
But if she kills him, he can't.
But if she killed him, she could. So Lizzie got the military pension. Maybe there's a commissary at Mattawan. Yeah, what's she going to spend it on? A law was quickly passed to change that. She is thought to obtain sexual satisfaction in this murders, and this is 1912. And if you know anything about the BSU, the Federal the FBI's BSU, Behavioral Science Unit, they later deemed, like in the 1970s, that serial killers received sexual satisfaction from their murders, even though there's no sexual contact. So this guy was way ahead of his time, Dr. Flint, in terms of seeing what was really wrong with her. Nellie's final resting place is an abandoned cemetery behind Matawan, where her stone is simply a number. That number is a mystery to all of us here. We're not allowed to know that number. Paul, on the other hand, is in a beautiful, shady Walker Valley cemetery, buried next to his first wife and his son. And Lizzie has fallen into relative obscurity. So I don't know if you guys want spoilers.
No.
Thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
We're going to move over to Paul.